Okay, when we're dealing with Matthew 24 and the two parallel passages, there's a huge difficulty in dealing with them, I think. And once in every year, as the church year gets to a close, your preaching kind of goes into eschatological apocalyptic gear. You're going to, it's the end of the church year, but the theme is the end of the world. And it coincides also with the end of the calendar year. And we kind of do it year after year. The church has done it century after century, and it seems to make no difference. Now, I remember being a kid, and a couple of people knock on the front door, go to the front door. It's Jehovah's Witnesses, and two ladies standing there with the authorized version of the Bible. They're in Matthew 24, and they begin with wars, rumors of wars, and earthquakes. And aren't we experiencing this? And that is their way in. The problem is nation rising up against nation and kingdom against kingdom is kind of the bread and butter of human history. So I find it amazing, you see, people get all chalked out of shape that Europeans came over, colonized the New World, took it over. Well, clearly Spain and Portugal conquered Central and Southern America. It's a war of conquest. And isn't that absolutely terrible? Aren't they awful? And the people they conquered, weren't they just wonderful? They had an idyllic civilization before the white man got there. Well, in the age of exploration, especially in the 17th century, the myth arose of the noble savage. And with the noble savage, it's European settlers go and they find a civilization where people are nice, there's no disease, there's no war, they have just this lovely life. And it's those wicked Europeans who come over and bring wickedness and disease and cause all kinds of problems with the societies. And yet we know, and well, I know more with respect to Canada, that when the French come, and they come even before the British, the French were kind of interesting, actually, because when the French came to the New World, to New Quebec, the policy was they should intermarry with the natives. So intermarriage was encouraged. In Quebec, there's an awful lot of people with indigenous ancestry. And I was in a part of Nova Scotia, saw the records of these French soldiers. They marry a savage. The way it's written, they married une sauvage. But hey, they had a human marriage with them. And the French plan was, we're going to sort of take over but Christianize as we go and intermarry. That's not quite the same thing as genocide, I don't think. But what we know about the various tribes in Canada is before the French came and then the British get in on the act, they were having wars with each other and wiping each other out. Well, in Europe, what were they doing? The whole period, even in the Christian period, having wars with each other. And so I remember being in Germany when Russia invaded Afghanistan, or the Soviet Union did. Was that at the end of 79 or 8, sometime like that? And left-wing American students saying, oh, they just couldn't believe this could happen in the modern world. And then people couldn't believe Russia invaded Ukraine. Well, somebody with a capital letter, capital S, said, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And that's really been the story of human history. So you can't read any dating of the Second Advent from nation rising up against nation, kingdom against kingdom, earthquakes and famines in various places. Well, Well, the Lord says this is the beginning of the birth pangs, using a metaphor from the delivery of a baby. It's kind of interesting. The image of the birth pangs indicates it's going to intensify and it's going to result in something really dramatic. So I remember when our first child was born, a daughter, Bonnie's water broke over supper. It was on Vicarage. We go down to see the pastor and his wife, who say, get to hospital, we'll look after your dog. And, well, of course, they start, the obstetrician checks your wife, checks the lady to see how far she's dilated. She was dilating some, and our doctor said, oh, I'm going to go home, see you in the morning. And I just said very politely, would you check my wife again, please? And he goes, oh, 8 centimeters, I better stay. And we also are off to the delivery room, and she was complaining that it was happening too fast. And he was quite funny. He said, honey, most of the girls make the opposite complaint, that it's too slow. So, and there you are, you have a baby. Well, the image does indicate there's a process with an end, and the image carries in it intensification. The signs will intensify as you go on. But with so many of them, you really cannot get specific to a particular time and place in history, because so many of them are happening all the time. Now, and when the gospel has been preached to all the nations as a sign to them, then the end will come. Well, when has the gospel been preached to all the nations? Interestingly, Paul says the gospel that has been preached to every creature under heaven. Doesn't he say that in Colossians? And Wilhelm Lehr makes the claim the gospel has in fact been proclaimed to everyone, even though we cannot demonstrate that rationally. Well, there's not really any way of demonstrating the time at which the gospel has been preached to every nation. I knew a lady in a Lutheran congregation. She and her husband remained Lutheran, became evangelical missionaries, didn't have a Lutheran theology. Very lovely people. They had a different religion. They were a member of a Lutheran congregation because they were Germans. And she once said, oh, so many places have to be evangelized yet. So many peoples have to be evangelized yet. The end cannot possibly be yet. She's pitching it into the future. Well, does the gospel have to be preached in every native language and dialect? You see, in the ancient world, when the apostles go forth into the Roman Empire in the East, they preached in Greek. They didn't preach in every little local language, did they? They preached in Greek, and they could be understood by just about everybody in the society. So, we have Lutheran Bible translators of Canada, and in some African place in a Muslim area, they're translating the Bible into the local dialect. Well, does the Bible have to be translated into absolute every little local dialect? Because in Africa, the overwhelming majority of the people, you can reach them in either English or French. Because in Africa, again, many of them are bilingual, where they'll have a native language, and the country functions in English or French. So, but there's no real way of checking when you say, oh, the gospel has been preached to all nations, now the end is going to come. So, now, the dogmaticians talk about the signs that kind of happen all the time, and then the signs which indicate a closer propinquity or a closer, greater closeness to the actual end. Well, and I suppose rebellion against God in the left and right-hand kingdom will come to a climax. Now, what I do find interesting, though, or no, interesting wouldn't be the word. It's almost freakish. It's very hard to handle. The Lord will say, these are the signs. When you observe these things, know that he is near, even at the gates. Lift up your heads, ye mighty gates. Behold, the King of glory waits. And then he says, and the Son of Man will come at a time you do not expect. So we're given all the signs. We're told to be mindful of them, and therefore to be ready, but it's still going to be a big surprise anyway. There's no way, humanly speaking, you can bring it all together and work it out, is there? Therefore, well, what is going on in apocalyptic literature? That's a big issue to deal with. I have had the thought, eschatology is not futurology. Do you remember, going back to the 1960s, you had an academic discipline, futurology, and you had professors giving lectures on futurology, where they're lecturing you about what the future is going to be like. And there was an American academic I remember seeing on the BBC, Thomas Kuhn, and he was a futurologist, and he would tell you how things were going to be. And then there was a BBC program that came on several times a week, Tomorrow's World. And these scientists who were journalists would very confidently tell you what was going to happen a generation or two later, and how modern science would in some way be harvested to change the world. Like when gas was discovered in the North Sea, and that was gas rather than oil to begin with. I remember in the 60s, scientists said we were entering a cooling period. And one night on this program, they said, well, the gas from the North Sea would light a huge Bunsen burner in the sea, and that would warm the sea up, and that would make the country warmer. And in the 60s, it was thought something could be done to avert global cooling and make the temperature of Northern Europe warmer. And now we hear the world is boiling, etc., etc. You can't really believe that stuff, can you? But you had that discipline of futurology. In the field of literature, in the 20th century, you had fiction, which was in the genre of what you call dystopia, where utopia, where it's nowhere in particular, but you describe an ideal state of affairs. There's a utopia somewhere. So Thomas More writes a fiction utopia, and Francis Bacon in the next century, he had his utopia. You had Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. But in the 20th century, you had nightmare scenarios depicted in fiction. So I think of H.G. Wells. And H.G. Wells wrote the book The War of the Worlds, in which he imagined an invasion from outer space. And I remember people getting really worked up about this, where they were expecting alien invasions. They'd read H.G. Wells and take it seriously. You then had the journalist George Orwell, who wrote Animal Farm and 1984, where he sort of pictures the way modern technology interacts with the state apparatus, and he imagines a dystopian condition of hell on earth for people. And then you had Aldous Huxley, who wrote The Brave New World. What's interesting is Aldous Huxley was an agnostic. He was not a believer, but his Brave New World in many ways has been kind of realized. And you read it, and you see he was really on the ball. Now, eschatology should not degenerate into futurology. What is apocalyptic literature trying to get us to do? In the book of Daniel, it's trying to encourage fidelity among the Jews, right? When was the book of Daniel written? What is its date? And maybe more important, when was the book of Daniel released? Because Daniel is told to commit the words of the vision, and it will be released at the proper time. Certainly, the book of Daniel was highly relevant at the time of Antiochus IV, the Seleucid king, who is the first one to launch a very specific religious persecution of the Jews, where he forbids the practice of Judaism and commands the worship of Zeus Olympus and the sacrifice of a pig on the altar of the temple. And that leads to the revolt of the Hasmonean family of the priesthood, Mattathias and his sons, beginning with Judas Maccabeus. And they end up securing the independence of Israel. They grab the high priesthood, to which they had no right. Then they grab the monarchy, to which they had no right. And they are the rulers of Judea until the Romans take over, until Pompey comes. But what is the purpose of Daniel? Is the purpose of Daniel to give you a blow-by-blow description of events that are yet to come, or is it primarily to encourage fidelity among the Jews? Well, chapter 1 of Daniel, I mean, you're encouraged to keep the food laws and the dietary restrictions of the Pentateuch. Then when you have Nebuchadnezzar and the great image that he set up, and all peoples, nations, and languages are to fall down and worship it, the three holy children decline to. They remain faithful. They fall into the fire. The Lord is in the fire. They are delivered. Envy delivers Daniel over to the death penalty that King Darius cannot change. Daniel is faithful. But surely, apocalyptic literature encourages fidelity. And what is the last book of the New Testament all about? I could never do a seminary class on Revelation. I would get far too confused with it. I would be reluctant to do a Bible class of Revelation. You'd have to be really disciplined and know what you're doing, I think, to do that. I find it very, very hard. And for years and years, I never read a really satisfactory commentary on Revelation. I thought Louis Brighton came pretty close to really getting to the heart of it. But many things in Revelation are impossible to understand definitively. I think if anyone says they have the definitive understanding of the revelation to St. John, you should call 911. There was a Serbian jeweler in St. Catherine's. He and his family had great jewels. They did have great jewelry. His mother was very weird, but he was Orthodox. He told me he read the Bible a lot, and he was fascinated by Revelation. And one day I was in, and he was explaining Revelation, and he told me that Madeleine Albright, who was the U.S. Secretary of State, was she? Yes, she was the Secretary of State, that she was the whore of Babylon. Well, I was perfectly willing to agree. I mean, the lady may not have been stellar in every respect, but I'm not entirely sure she was the whore of Babylon. So anyone who claims to understand, to have that definitive interpretation, you don't. You have to go kind of easily. Even in Revelation 6, when, with one of the seals are opened, and out comes the rider on a white horse. Well, there was a Canadian Lutheran theologian, C.H. Little. He was a theologian of other synod at the Waterloo Seminary into the 1950s. And apparently he frequently worshipped with the Missouri Synod, a very conservative Lutheran. And he had the rider on the white horse was either Christ or the Antichrist. And Martin Franzmann has it the other way around. So if you're preaching that Sunday, you simply cannot get too specific, I don't think. Because, you have equally respectable Lutheran exegetes giving totally opposite interpretations. But what does it mean that, blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this book and who keeps what is written therein? How do you keep the revelation to St. John? You don't keep it by computing the future. And you simply cannot compute the future by it. And you don't know to what extent it's chronological anyway. Is it chronological in a pure and simple sense? Or does he kind of revisit the same ground and put it slightly differently as he goes, which is what John does in the Gospel? And if it's the same author, that makes sense. So presumably the way you keep revelation is by being faithful, right? Rather than by speculation about dates and times and seasons. Any dogmatics, it's written in a time and in a place. So I talk about signs of rebellion against Almighty God in the world and in the church. We might use the images of the area, what is governed by God's left hand, what is governed by his right hand. And I really focused on communism. And going up to around 1990, that was culturally and historically very relevant, wasn't it? Because no one here is tremendously young, as far as I can see. Well, that young fellow's not that old. You're about 40, are you? 48?
No, almost 52.
Are you? Oh, okay. And you're one of the kids present, right? Yeah. Well, the generation of Roger Pavler and myself, you're coming out of the Second World War. Your fathers and their generation, they had that memory of World War II. My father and father-in-law participated in it. And then you grow up in the Cold War. And the embodiment of evil is the Soviet Union. And you really think of the Soviet Union as an embodiment of great rebellion against God. So you think of it apocalyptically. The Zalk has a theologian, Bernard Klein. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's probably the most learned man, knowledgeable historian and systematician in the Zalk. Just a year older than myself. And he came and taught for us in 2020. His visit was cut short by the whole lockdown COVID nonsense. And I think when he got home, he'd wanted to read my eschatology, so he got a copy and he wrote me a commentary on it. And he says, well, dear John, that's okay that you focus on Soviet communism as this great manifestation of evil and rebellion against God. Then he says, what about Nazism? I hadn't really gone into that. And that provoked me to read a major biography of Hitler, which I read twice, and then in connection with Sasse, got into the German church conflict of the 1930s. Well, there is certainly something apocalyptic in the sense of revealing what is deeply going on about Nazism as that rebellion against God, as Luther would say, in his kingdom and government. That's true. But then, what other manifestations can we think of that are going on right now, of which we are not aware? And what other manifestations of such rebellion are coming down the turnpike? We can't simply go from these things we observe to the Lord is coming back within a year, 5 years, 10 years. Doesn't really work that way, does it? No. So, if apocalyptic literature is seeking to encourage fidelity, which is certainly the case, well, it's certainly the case in Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21. You know, the one who endures to the end will be saved. And in Matthew and Mark, at the end of the discourse, who then is the faithful steward whom the Lord will be found, feeding the people at the time of his return? It's an encouragement of fidelity. Now, in the processing of these things, I find Christian fiction can be pretty useful. Now, we have had Christian fiction done by premillennialists who will describe the awful things that are coming down the turnpike, and this is all leading up to the rapture and whatnot and whatnot. I've been influenced as a Canadian. At the end of the 90s, a seminarian said to me, "Have you ever read a novel by Michael O'Brien called Father Elijah?" I don't know if anyone's ever read Michael O'Brien's Father Elijah. Well, anyway, this student told me, "You must read this novel." And I wasn't disagreeing. But I found myself with a gentleman who is now the Archpriest Gregory on a Good Friday, I think, of the year 2001, in Baker's bookstore in Grand Rapids, a theological bookstore. And I overheard this Reformed minister. He was talking about the sovereignty of God and how God in Christ are sovereign over every inch of space. And I was standing there listening to him thinking, my, this is interesting to hear a Reformed minister talking this way, using conceptuality that we don't usually use. And then I saw a copy of Michael O'Brien's Father Elijah. Went home and read it, was enthralled. I've read it at least 10 times since. And I enjoyed it so much I wrote to the author, care of Ignatius Press, and got a reply that he wrote from his place of residence in the Ottawa Valley. And I've got to know the guy. And he has produced a series of novels called Children of the Last Days. Now, Michael O'Brien is a John Paul II, Benedict XVI Roman Catholic, a very nice guy. And he is convinced that the eschatological apocalyptic pot is moving to the boil. So that we're living in an intensification of last times phenomena. And in Father Elijah, he describes a pope who is a very thinly disguised John Paul II, a cardinal prefect of the doctrine who is obviously Joseph Ratzinger. And there's this Jewish convert who is living as a Carmelite monk in Israel. And the Pope summons him to bear witness to a president of the European Union who is looking suspiciously like the Antichrist. And it's a wonderful novel, and it's wonderful to get into his stuff. But the interesting thing is, O'Brien never dates the Lord's return. He never gives specific prophecies. And what he's really concerned about is to describe people falling away and people standing fast in the present. And he does that in his novels, which I really commend to you. They're fun. I'm surprised you haven't read Father Elijah. No? I never put you onto it. Sorry?
The name of the author is
Michael D. O'Brien, O''Brien. And well, and what he has, I mean, he's historically very sensitive. He begins with this boy who is going to be a rabbi. He's a Jew in Poland, and his family are taken away in the extermination of the Jews under the Third Reich. And he escapes, and this single Catholic bookseller puts him up, and he ends up escaping, and he escapes to Israel, where he gives up religion. He goes into Israeli public life, and his wife is blown up by the Palestinians, and he suffers great despair. Then he has a conversion experience, gets baptized, becomes a good Catholic, becomes a priest and a Carmelite friar. And he's given the name Father Elijah. As the book goes on, by the way, he becomes a big associate of Brother Enoch. So the whole idea is, are we in Revelation 11? And the Pope summons him over to bear witness to this president, who is, a very typical Tony Blair, Barack Obama type. That's the type he is. And it becomes a very dramatic tale with murder, conspiracy, lies, and all the rest of it. And Elijah ends up being accused of carrying on with an Italian judge lady who becomes a friend of his. And he ends up being consecrated a bishop by the Pope in the Vatican on Christmas Day, and he escapes to Turkey. And then he gets told he has to go and bear witness in Israel, you see. And the novel ends with Enoch and Elijah walking to Jerusalem, and there's a quotation from Revelation 11. Well, it's a wonderful novel. And O'Brien started as an artist. He's still an artist. He was a 1960s hippie who reverted to his Roman Catholic religion and decided, well, he wanted to be an artist. And he was told, you're a good artist, but the things you do, no one is interested in now. So he and his wife lived a very risky life, and during poverty and hardship, he pursued his art. They raised 6 children. And around 1990, he decided to write. And he wrote this novel, Father Elijah, sent it to publishers who refused it. And then Ignatius Press in San Francisco accepted it. It became a bestseller. And he's written and published all kinds of other novels which relate to the Elijah story. One of them is a trilogy of life in Canada between 1900 and 2000. And he has this English middle-class lady emigrates to British Columbia. An Irishman murders a British soldier, and he comes, very surreptitiously to British Columbia. They end up getting married. And the Irishman's a good Catholic. The woman converts on her deathbed, and he tells you this story of Canadian life through the 20th century. And in the last volume, and as the second volume comes to an end, Canada has turned into a totalitarian state with a hostility to religion. And, well, I was reading this in the early 2000s, and I thought he's 20 years ahead of time, or he's 30 years ahead of time. And then all of a sudden you think, oh, no, he's kind of describing Canada as it is. It's enthralling. And he has a whole bunch of other novels. And then he has a follow-up novel, Elijah in Jerusalem. So Elijah and Enoch get into Jerusalem. Well, the first novel obviously ends around 2000. And he claims that John Paul II is still on the throne, but he remembers the reign of Benedict XVI, and he says, the chronology is all askew. There's no way I can get the chronology right. But Enoch and Elijah come into Jerusalem to bear witness against this president who's an antichristic figure. And are they Enoch and Elijah? Well, no, because they bear witness. Enoch gets shot. Elijah gets injured, dies of his injuries. But it's a beautiful novel. And I wrote a review of it in Gottesdienst. And before I was a Gottesdienst editor, there's a Gottes blog where I'm reviewing Elijah in Jerusalem. And I thought, well, I'd already was writing to and back and forth with the author. And I think we even had each other's emails. But I forwarded him the blog. And one day I came out of class and the receptionist said, oh, Mr. O'Brien called you up. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I telephoned him and we talked for an hour or so. And he told me he thought I'd really understood what his fiction was about. But the way he interprets it is really good. I mean, he thinks there's a real intensification in our time, and stuff is getting ready to happen. But he refuses to be terribly precise or give dates, which is what you have to do. And then in 2017, I preached for Reformation in the Ottawa Valley. It's very beautiful, west of Ottawa, as you go along the river, Ottawa River. It's a lovely forested area. We have quite a few churches there. And so I went up and preached in the church where Richard John Newhouse was baptized and where he grew up. And there were people there who remembered him because he had a family cottage where he used to go up there every summer. And I knew I'd be up there, and I arranged to meet with Michael O'Brien. And on my way back, I stopped by and had coffee with him and a visit. It was really interesting. And I said to him, Michael, you know what I've written about Pope Francis. Does it offend you? He says, oh, no, not in the least. So the things I'd written about Frankenstein, no, not in the least. And we were talking about him. And this guy who, I mean, an absolutely straight JP2, B16 Roman Catholic, he's referring to Bergoglio and said, he's not my father. That's 2017. Well, you're really in a situation where a very well-informed Roman Catholic says, the Pope is not my father, because they would bend over backwards to have the right respect, wouldn't they? But I'd really commend his fiction to you. And in 2008, when we published the first edition of Reinhardt's poetry, My Light and My Salvation, we did it through the press at Redeemer Fort Wayne. Do they call that Redeemer Lutheran Press? And Michael Fries was the editor of it. We did it through them, and Michael O'Brien allowed us to use an icon he's done, Christ the Word of Life. So in the first edition, that icon is on the front of the book. In the second edition, Kurt's nephew, who is an artist, who has learned Coptic iconography, he has an icon of the Transfiguration on it. But I really commend the fiction of Michael O'Brien as a way of really grappling with the signs of the present. He's associated with the editor of LifeSite News. I don't know if you ever go on LifeSite News. The editor lives in the Ottawa Valley in Barry's Bay, which is where Michael O'Brien lives. And a few years ago, in lockdown, Bonnie and I went up for a few days in the Ottawa Valley, and on Sunday we went to the church that these two guys attend. It was really rather interesting because usually you go to a Novus Ordo Roman Mass, and it is so blasé, and the homily is so, dull and without anything, and they go through the motions, and you're not sure whether they believe a word of it. And here it wasn't Latin Mass, although they used the Roman canon, but you could tell they were actually believing in the religion, and lots of young families and stuff like that. But I really commend Michael O'Brien to you.
No question.
Question.
Yeah.
About these signs of the end, the intensification, the boiling of the times. What is the reason for your thinking of why we are told there will be a little season? Isn't it in Revelation 20? Isn't it so that we have some discernment, we start to make some of these associations? Well, not specifically saying it's coming because of this Secretary of State or whatever of Babylon or something like that. Aren't we possibly, too far to the other side of saying, well, things have always been as they've always been, but what we've seen is marriage completely redefined, gender. That is, but you can't say out loud what gender is, and you have gendered languages that have stood for centuries, and the technological advances have just sped exponentially beyond up in the 20th and then 21st century, and all of these things seem in the world government, all this pressure seems to indicate definitely different. It's definitely different. Now, how can God offer a correction? Of course, He can, but we might be a little bit too hesitant to say anything.
Thank you. Yes, I absolutely agree. You're perfectly right. I think you raised there at least three issues. First of all, you have the little season. Is that a mikros chronos in Revelation 20? It's a mikros something, and presumably it's chronos. There's that little season, that little period of time at the end of the 1,000 years. And again, what does that mean? I mean, from the time of Augustine, the age of the church has been the 1,000 years. In the second century, Justin Martyr and Irenaeus and Polycarp, it seems, understood it very literally as a 1,000-year period. So in historic Lutheranism, you had chiliasm, and the pietists did all kinds of stuff with eschatology, where they were expecting some kind of intermediate kingdom of Christ before the final coming and the final judgment. Francis Pieper in the Dogmatics says, theologians today are denying the vicarious atonement, indicating we're in this little season. Now, you then come in with the recent intensification of the signs. Yeah. Well, some of us lived through the 1960s. Very few of us are young enough not to have done. I don't know how many of you lived through the 1960s. I'm looking around and not knowing the ages precisely. Well, you're my generation. We lived through it. Sorry?
I lived through the 1960s.
Yes. You see, I remember in Great Britain at the end of the 50s and the early 60s, the last days of a conservative government in Britain, it was the reign of President Eisenhower in the United States. And I just remember something different. And then all of a sudden you get into the mid-60s, things are changing. You had the Kennedy administration, you had Khrushchev in Russia, you had the Second Vatican Council, which wrought immense religious change. Then you had the student rebellions of the 1960s. You had the collapse of the sexual mores, which was made feasible by the contraceptive pill. All of a sudden, it was really easy to break number 6 without any consequences, where previously, you kind of knew you had to restrain yourself, otherwise there might be consequences. And many couples waited because it was unsafe not to wait, right? The flesh was pushing them, and they realized, well, I just remember from that time, a next older cousin, I was his best man. He gets married. They lived with his parents for the first months of marriage. It's discovered Susan was pregnant when she went down the aisle. Well, that aunt was a little old devout Church of England lady, a tiny little old thing. Well, she beat her son physically for months, told him how filthy he was, how wicked he was. She just let him have it. And he wasn't forgiven until the grandmother was pushing the baby carriage around. Then it was forgiven at that point. But at that time, people were terrified to break number 6 because of what their parents would do to them if they did. That's first use of the law restraint, if you check it out, where the flesh does not want to be good, but it knows it has to be. Otherwise, the consequences will be so bad. Well, you had the 60s, so we've had these talks, Missouri Synod and Lutheran Church Canada, with Anglican Church of North America, who are really interesting people. I went down to Dallas, and I gave a paper, Graying Canadians and Americans Today, Products and Victims of the 1960s. And I read this paper in this Reformed Episcopal Acne Church in Dallas. And the people in front of me, they all had my hair color, You've gone prematurely white, I think, are you?
I started turning gray a long time ago, but I've earned it now. I'm 59. So.
Oh, yeah. Well, you're not a kid.
Getting gray on his victory. Yeah, he did too. Oh, man. Was that red pen?
Yeah. Is your dark hair artificial, Roger? No?
No.
No?
No.
It's real. Well, no. But anyway, this paper I gave, I can easily email it again to Greg. Graying Canadians and Americans Today, Products and Victims of the 60s. And the interesting thing is so many people were, oh, yeah. It produced us, and it kind of gave us a zillion problems. And then I built up in the paper, did all kinds of interesting stuff. You see, signs of the times, yes, okay, you're right. The little season may very well be intensifying. And, well, the work I did for that, there was a very interesting book came out, The Death of Christian Britain. Callum Brown is a sociologist, a Scot, and he produced this book, The Death of Christian Britain. He dated it to 1963, when obscenity laws collapsed in the high courts and all kinds of changes occurred. And he says, until 1963, Britain okay, the majority don't go to church, but it's a Christian culture. Well, I notice here it's a Christian culture in the South and in parts of the Midwest. You go to the coasts in New York State, you're not in a Christian culture anymore. Most of Canada is not a Christian culture. There are pockets left. Anyway, he uses a relatively new form of history. It's called oral history. And I don't know how many of you regret when you visited with your grandparents and your grandmother was telling the family story and you didn't write it down. As we've got into genealogy, I remember my grandmother talking about this, that, and the other person. And you're thinking, oh, I've heard this a zillion times before, and I'm going to hear it many times again before you die, and you're not attentive. Well, what he's done is the historian goes and visits with people and turns on, with permission, the tape recorder, and people tell the story of their lives, the role of religion in their lives. And he very beautifully tells how until 1963, an awful lot of people had a real connection to a Christian church. They might not have been all that religious, but their life is structured around it. And he talks about discursive Christianity, where the people who aren't practicing, they nevertheless go to funerals, memorial services, events with a Christian content. They know certain hymns. People in Britain now no longer know how to behave in church. In the 60s, people who didn't go to church, they knew they had to come in, kneel down, pray or pretend to pray, and they knew how to use the prayer book and the hymnal. And there were some hymns they knew by heart, because in the schools there had to be an act of Christian worship every day, and there would be, hymns, and it's in the culture. And he points out in 63, it kind of just breaks down to where you are now, where the Christianity is residual. There's hardly any left. And I've wondered if someone using the same method could write The Death of Christian Canada, when would you date it? Now, the death of the Christian United States, I think it can be dated at a different time in different places. And in some places it hasn't died yet. So I think in the South it hasn't died yet, has it? It's challenged. Is it fighting back? To some degree. The Missouri Synod is much more vibrant than Lutheran Church Canada. It's much more in mission mode. It's much more in your-face mode with Christian confession. Whereas in Canada, it's let's not have anybody notice us, We hope no one sees what we're doing. You're not in that mode at this time. So,
is that under penalty? I mean, is that the reason for that in Canada, or is it just a different culture? Because I know there are things in Canada now that you can't publicly say. At least that's what we hear down here.
Yeah, the police can come for you. Yeah. I don't know, until the Second World War, there was higher church attendance in Canada than in the States. The 60s happened. Well, your 60s new president got shot. You did have a bit of a conservative reaction leading to President Reagan. So when I came over here, when I first read O'Brien, I thought, no, he's 20 or 30 years ahead of the curve. In Canada, I don't think he is. I think he's kind of on the curve, and he knows the culture he's in. I wonder. But in Canada, a great cultural change happened under Justin Trudeau, the father, or the legal father, of the present Prime Minister. And he was Prime Minister 68 to 84. You see, a Prime Minister has more day-to-day power and authority than the President. The Prime Minister is not the head of state. He is the first servant of the sovereign, the Prime Minister of the Crown. So in the order of precedence, he's not at the top. In Canada, though, as in Britain, the Prime Minister governs most of the time by the royal prerogative. There's a reason why a Canadian Prime Minister would think twice about abolishing the monarchy, because the sovereignty of the Crown is the royal prerogative, and it's in the Prime Minister's pocket. And so once he's Prime Minister, there are things he can do without having to justify it to Parliament. He appoints the Governor-General, the Lieutenant Governor of the provinces, the judges, ambassadors. He doesn't go through Commons and Senate to do that. So I remember after coming to Canada, Jean Chrétien, the French Prime Minister, in the House of Commons, Mr. Speaker, Her Majesty the Queen has graciously acceded to my recommendation that somebody be Governor General. Well, that's a cute form of words. The Queen was told what to sign. You know what I mean? And the Prime Minister has immense power. And Pierre Trudeau, the father, he decided that Canada's constitution needed to be repatriated. You had the British North America Act of 1567, and he said, our constitution is sitting in Westminster. We need to bring it home. It was a terrible lie, because the Constitution was enacted by Queen Victoria in the British Parliament in 1867. It had been modified and applied and altered in various directions in Ottawa. And the British government, when they were told, we want to repatriate the Constitution, said, well, it's your Constitution, it's nothing to do with us. It's not our business. It's not our place to give permission. And he went through producing a new constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which enabled him to alter the structure of Canadian society, because the final authority now rests with the judges, not with Parliament. And the judges will tell Parliament if they've done something which is against the Charter. So, for example, when same-sex marriage was on the horizon, I think in the province, the Ontario Supreme Court said that the definition of marriage was discriminatory. And then the Supreme Court said the definition of marriage in law was discriminatory and had to be changed. And the Prime Minister at the time, Paul Martin, said, I'm just following the Constitution. I'm just obeying the judges. Well, you have to be a fool not to see what's going on. Who appointed the bloody judges? The Prime Minister did. So Trudeau has his Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the ones who interpret it are the Supreme Court justices who are appointed by the Prime Minister. And Justin Trudeau has now appointed the great majority of the senators, you see. The senators are appointed directly by the Prime Minister, who recommends to His or Her Excellency the Governor-General. And His or Her Excellency the Governor-General says, yes, Prime Minister. You see? So huge power rests in the Prime Minister, who is not accountable. In the old British system, the riding, in Britain, the constituency, selects somebody to stand for Parliament who may or may not be elected. They get to Parliament, they follow their own judgment. They don't have to, back in the day, they didn't have to obey the party leader. What's come in now is, if the party leader doesn't like the way the MP is behaving, the party leader unilaterally deselects them. So, any Liberal MP who doesn't want to vote for Trudeau's program will be severely punished. They won't stand again. So we have the form of a so-called democracy. We do not have the reality of a democracy. You have government by irresponsible elites. And yes, I'll be corrected, or I'll be emboldened to push on that, yes, that whole sexual revolution, well, again, people in the 60s said, well, it's being permitted, but it's not being encouraged or mandated. Well, now, courts in the United Kingdom are ordering some women to abort their babies, women with physical or mental conditions. Some woman with a mental condition, a judge says, you will abort your baby, no appeal. Must happen. So, yes, I mean, the whole sexual revolution is being entrenched. Then, I mean, and you've got to the point of, and you see, no one even sees that same-sex marriage is a logical impossibility anymore. And I've noticed the newspapers, they just use, Sir Elton John and his husband, and you all have to accept that, and and the other way. But Johanna Pohjola, when he was with us, he thought things had gone so catastrophically downhill in the West. The end must be soon. The Lord's return must be soon. Transhumanism, posthumanism.
Is technological saviors. They find eternal life through technology.
Yes. Yeah. So no, I absolutely agree. Well, I think on the first page I quote a Second-day Adventist writer, the signs are intensifying. But that goes with the image, doesn't it? Yeah, I mean, any lady who's had a baby knows she experiences contractions, and they intensify, and she dilates to the point where the delivery starts.
One point in the book I found very helpful, that where you said the false messiahs who will come could be corporate or ideological, instead of just the guy on the street with the sign that says "I'm Jesus." But transhumanism or something like that is a false ideological messiah that draws people away from Christ and accountability to their own construction of afterlife, man and machine living on together.
Yeah. Well, I read something recently about artificial intelligence. I have no idea what it is. I mean, I have a limited amount of the natural kind, but whatever it is, and pointed out this could be a gateway to the demonic. Well, do we in our generation, are we experiencing more demonic activity requiring pastoral care? My dear colleague, friend, Brother Harold Ristow, when he was a pastor in Montreal and when he was a military chaplain, he practiced a ministry of exorcism. I'm sure there is such a thing. Walther in his pastoral gives 14 signs of demonic possession. He talks about how you deal with it. At the very end, Walther says, and you might need to perform an exorcism. And he has that in his pastoral. But I think in all likelihood, he never really encountered it. He's living in a deeply Christian society, whether it's Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed, Anglo, whatever it be. And he'd undoubtedly think these other people are deeply heretical, but not necessarily demonic. And you don't, well, to what extent is the New Age movement a sign of the times, embracing some of the things you mentioned? So I wrote this in the 1990s. I get into New Age. Well, when I was at Fort Wayne, I went down to preach for a pastor in Indianapolis, stayed over, and before we left, he photocopied a whole bunch of stuff for me about the New Age movement. And he went on and on about the New Age movement. My eyes glazed over, but I'd come down to preach for Fort Wayne. You have to be polite. So thank you, Pastor, you take us. And when I left my vicarage supervisor says, John, do you have anything I should have that the secretary should copy before you leave? And I said, oh yes, I've got this folder on the New Age movement. I started to tell him about the New Age movement. I looked at him, his eyes glazed over. He says, oh, yeah, give it to Marlon, have her copy it. They came to see us a year later, or a year or two later, and we're godparents to our second daughter. And from the moment he walked in the door, that's all he talked about, because he'd noticed stuff happening in the parish. That was Western Iowa in the mid-'80s, where you would think, nothing weird would happen, it was all hogs and corn and the rest of it, you see. And he discovered occult stuff happening among his parishioners, and he discovered he had to do a bit of this special ministry stuff, and he discovered that he had a ministry in confession and absolution. Because when I was in that parish, he was in the US military, an intelligence officer. He would go twice a year to Omaha, not chaplaincy. And of course, the vicar had to do the Sunday service, and the vicar had to look after the show while pastor's away for maybe up to 10 days. Well, one time, an old lady pushed her husband into my office one day, and he was really out of it. He wasn't in his right mind. And she sat down and confessed his sins. If men are not able to articulate their own sins, their wives can do it beautifully, without any difficulty. If the pastor comes and says, what are his sins? If he's hesitant to divulge them, his wife can list them minutely, you see? Anyway, she confesses his sins, and he sits there, oh, yeah. And well, they're in public knowledge. Alcoholism, how this had destroyed the family. And I'm a vicar. What do you do? I said, well, do you know about absolution, forgiveness? John chapter 20. Then the catechism, what do we believe according to these words? May a vicar grant holy absolution? Interesting question in pastoral theology. I thought, oh, what the heck do I do? He said he wanted absolution. So I get up, and what I said was, as a servant of the word, I didn't claim to be called and ordained. Anyway, then the guy went away, and it was really almost too funny. A few days later, he went to the diner, and he said, I don't know what that goddamn vicar did, but I got my best night's sleep in years. Anyway, the pastor comes back and says, what happened in my absence? I said, oh, came in, and this is what happened. He said, you did the right thing. What did he confess? I said, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. I said, because it's public knowledge, but I can't tell you. Well, he blew up, and he said, you may have a doctorate in theology, but I'm your commanding officer. You must tell me. I said, no, page 311 in Lutheran worship. So we go to individual confession and absolution. It can't be divulged. And he said, oh, no one ever told me that at Fort Wayne. But then stuff happened. And he discovered, he was very good with one-on-one. And he discovered that was a big part of his ministry. But then he discovered what was going on in the New Age stuff. And it was going on in Western Iowa in the mid-1980s. So what's it doing in the mid-2020s? It's much more intense at this point, isn't it? See, I remember going out in the 90s to San Francisco, and on the television, there was stuff about your psychic advisor, and you had people offering seances, spirit mediums, palm readings. That was all publicly advertised on a storefront. And I've noticed now that's happening much more regularly. I think I saw it somewhere in Iowa last week, which, I mean, for one of the duller parts of the nation where you don't expect much to be going on. Well, but the New Age movement wasn't new. It was old paganism and theosophy. And in 1975, it was new with Shirley MacLaine. Now, those New Agers are in the old folks' home or they're dead. Before long, you're going to have a similar movement with a different packaging. So historically, there's never anything new, is there? What goes around comes around. And so one year, I was planting a vegetable garden, and I was standing at the garden center, and I was looking at, they had moo poo and sheep manure. And I was trying to resolve the very difficult theological issue. Should I use sheep manure or moo poo? What's the difference? So there's a sales clerk, she's zipping down the aisle, and I turned around and said, what's the difference between sheep manure and moo poo? And she whizzes by and she said, same crap, different rap. Now, and in church history, you see, if you do the Apostolic Fathers and see what the issues are, those issues, they can't just keep on coming back, but they come back under a different name. So I would agree, yes, all of that stuff. And yes, the genderism stuff that we're dealing with, there's a little bit of a pushback against it, but yeah, these things are signs of great intensification. So yes, we need to be prepared. But even when you think of rebellion against God, both in the world and in the church, I mean, it's always been seething. It's always been there doing something. It's been intensifying. But the forces of evil can now establish a tyranny much more easily. Technology enables that. And, oh, well, heavens, modern communications and internet and so forth. Look at the way things were monitored during the lockdowns. I mean, in Canada for a while, you had to be very careful leaving your house because this could be noticed. And the tyrants of earlier ages might have wanted world dominion. They couldn't quite get it. So if you were on the outs with a really mean medieval pope, for many months of the year he couldn't get to you because you're at the top of a snow-covered mountain and there's nothing they can do. With today's technology, they can check you out very easily. Yes. So, yeah. What is the significance that you've gone from, Lutheranly speaking, the best pope since the Counter-Reformation to one of the worst popes of all time? Well, I mean, for the Roman Catholics, when they deal with this stuff, you have private revelation. Has some heavenly personage appeared here on earth indicating something, giving prophecies? Well, for the Roman Catholics, they claim various appearances of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Our Lady of La Salette in France in 1846 said, Rome will lose the faith and become the seat of Antichrist. Well, you go around the traditionalist Catholic internet, and they're linking Frankenstein with Our Lady of La Salette. But again, I mean, yeah, there are signs of intensification. So apostasy, is it intensifying? I mean, heresy has always been there. Apostasy has always been happening. But now many major church bodies, they're not just heretical. That would almost be cute and endearing. They've gone to outright rejection of the whole faith. So the mainline Anglican Communion now, they've gone the whole way on human sexuality. The Church of England is, they just ordained or consecrated in Wales as bishop a priest in his 40s who's engaged to his boyfriend. And they wonder why the Anglican Church of North America is talked out of shape with them. Yeah. So yes, massive intensification. I even wondered, was there a spiritual meaning of 9/11 that never got articulated? I've encountered some people who had dreams and premonitions of something very dramatic happening before 9/11. One was a charismatic Lutheran boy of the other synod who just walked into my office and started talking one day. What happened to him? I don't know. But 9/11 was taken as an attack on the sovereignty of the United States. Well, it was. It was an act of aggression, albeit not by a foreign state as such, but by someone who was protected by a foreign state. Well, spiritually, the reaction to 9/11 was therapy, wasn't it? It wasn't a call to repentance. Who articulated after 9/11, this is a call to repentance? Very few preachers. Instead, the preachers turned to comfort mode, didn't they? And you had a big national service presided over by your favorite clergy person, Pastor Oprah, right? And that caused ructions in Missouri, did it not? With Yankee Stadium. I wonder to what extent that was an appeal for repentance. The appeal has been unheeded. Therefore, would more severe chastisement befall us?
The same with COVID. The churches aren't filled after COVID.
Yeah.
In fact, they're less filled.
Yes. Well, less so, but I invite you to come to Canada sometime. You know? Well, I had a sense early on that there was something apocalyptic and eschatological going on with the COVID and the lockdowns. And churches in Canada closed even before the government asked them to. I mean, it was made clear there's some huge health crisis. I think Lutheran Church Canada recommended closure for an indefinite period, even before the government had asked for that. And I would believe that was a mistake. Well, after the Ascension, the 120 meet together in one place and they pray. You have the descent of the Holy Spirit. Paul says, when you come together in one place, it is not the Lord's Supper you are holding, indicating you come together in one place and you celebrate the sacrament. Well, I don't know how you do that online. That's become a controversy, of course. But in Lutheran Church Canada, as churches reopened and opened more and more, to begin with, we could only have 5 people for a service. Well, you couldn't have an organist. You have a pastor and 4 people. Kurt Reinhardt, I think, was doing 7 Holy Communion services on a Sunday, several on a Saturday, and some during the week. Again, it's a good way to destroy the community. At least they kept going. Some people didn't. It's been very hard to rebuild. But then when you had all the lockdown and the pressure to get the vaccinations, I had a sense when that started up and was at its height, that Revelation 13, you couldn't buy and sell without the mark of the beast. In my lifetime, that had never been fulfilled. You were able to go about your life without taking the mark of the beast, whatever that be. And Tom Winger agreed that, well, if this isn't the mark of the beast from Revelation 13, what is? Well, it blew over, but it's blown over for how long? And what is the next excuse going to be for governmental intervention, regulation? You are much more fortunate. I mean, you have your amendments, and, the state may not establish any religion, nor may it prohibit the free exercise thereof. Well, in Canada, we have our rights, but there's a notwithstanding clause. If the government deems it expedient, they can take your rights from you. So we don't have rights like you do. It's a different ballgame, But
you can come join us in about a month. So you can come join us in about a month.
Yes, yeah. Well, honestly, when you had the pressure for the injections, my wife didn't take them. She's American. So when the border was open, she could come across. Getting back in, oh goodness, that was something. Then you were 2 weeks in quarantine, house arrest. The reason I got it in the fall of 2021 is we hadn't seen our family for 2 years. And Granddad wanted to see his grandchildren. And someone said to me when I got the injections, oh, look what you did for love of neighbor. I said, no, I did it to see the family. And I think also sinfully to have a quiet life. And I did the wrong thing. I should not have got the dumb injections. And why is it that so many young people are dropping dead all the time? Death rates have really increased, have they not? But in Canada, we were seeing the beast from Revelation 13. And in Canada, the government controls television and radio, CBC, television and radio. So the messages were what you were supposed to get. And I got to the point that I couldn't listen to the hourly news. I'd turn it off. And if I was listening, I would use words which you're not supposed to use in mixed company, because you get so angry with it.
Either way, I use words. We should not. It's not just men who feel that.
We can be worse, though. But anyway, but in Canada, it was really scary, and people were terrified, utterly terrified. And well, no wonder when you had these threats coming at you, and Justin Trudeau said, how can we tolerate the unvaxxed people? How can we tolerate these people? Using unvaxxed people of spreading the disease, and he wasn't even giving out a vaccine. They had to change the definition of an epidemic and a vaccine. So that was certainly apocalyptic intensification.
And it's still going on. I don't know if we caught Fauci's testimony yesterday. He said 200 to 300,000 more people died because of people who did not get vaccinated. He said that in front of Congress yesterday.
And blamed it on Christians specifically.
Yeah, without any evidence. And then I'd mentioned there was no basis for the social distancing, which really freaked people out, caused an awful lot of mental problems.
Yeah. I would point out as a physician that most vaccines, they've created a huge fund to compensate people who are injured. But these COVID vaccines, guess what? You cannot sue the manufacturer if you have. Yeah. So I suspect if that is not there, you would see. I think that and a lot of this transgender stuff, once the lawsuits hit the courts, I'm praying that a lot of this transgender garbage will.
Yeah. In the UK, they're expecting that to start happening now because clinics have, mutilated children's bodies by surgery. I mean, it's just too horrible to think about. In 2015, you see, my wife had been mainly a stay-home mother. She'd done some part-time work. She'd never accompanied me on trips. By 2014, the girls were all married. And she did have a job at the seminary, but she could accompany me. And we went to Germany in 2015. And in this nice hotel, we went to the sauna. Well, in Germany, you have to go into the sauna in your birthday suit. And there's a protocol of how you behave in the sauna. And men and women go together. And I kid you not, and take showers together, go together. And honestly, there were, in the sauna, there was a young man and a young woman that had been great models. And they were just as cool as cucumbers, in the sauna. And I thought, well, this is different in the sauna, And I thought, well, I can handle that if I have to. I would freak out if there were altered genitalia, altered sexual organs. I mean, that would just, sorry. And the whole idea that gender is assigned at birth. My wife was convinced all 3 times she was carrying a boy. She was carrying a girl. And we didn't ask what the sex was. We wanted to be surprised. And 2 of our daughters do the same. We discover at delivery. But the whole idea that you assign gender is so blasted stupid and frickin' ridiculous.
There are so many stupid scientists out there. I mean, your gender is what is in your chromosomes, and you cannot change that.
Yes. Well, follow the science.
Stuff that bottom line, you are what your chromosomes tell you you are.
Yes, because to use that mantra, follow the science, Kurt Reinhardt pointed out, when you're doing archaeology and you dig up old bones, you do that test and you know if it's a man or a woman whose bones are before you. Now, it might have been a man who wanted to be a woman or a woman who wanted to be a man. They may have cross-dressed. They had that in the Roman Empire, But it's a man or a woman. Yes, it's the science. Yeah. But there's something deeply demonic about this. Yeah. So the signs are intensifying. I really would recommend to you Kurt Reinhardt's poetry. I sent to Greg one poem, I think. Did you get it?
Yeah, everyone should have that.
Yeah. And he's done a lot of other stuff, but in 2020, he had other poems. And he had a beautiful poem on the second coming of our Lord coming soon, which is very beautiful. Some of his poems you can sing just as hymns, and they work very well in that way. Yes, so we are, the signs are intensifying. But in terms of the contractions and the dilation, how close we are to the actual delivery We don't know. But then, what is the purpose of the Eucharist? Well, it's always to give thanks. It's always to enjoy the presence of the ascended Lord. Lord Jesus, come. That's obviously related to the Lord's Supper at the end of 1 Corinthians 16. Is it asking him to come as we go to the altar with the sacrament? Or is it, even as he's on the altar, we're asking him to come publicly? We're asking him to complete the coming, aren't we? So every Lord's Supper is an anticipation of the parousia, and it's a request for the parousia. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, we'll break, then we have one more session today.